Hi everybody, welcome to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday the 24th. And it turns out I made a mistake during our last class, which makes perfect sense when I was thinking about why it seemed to be that we had more time than I had anticipated for the remainder of the semester. And that's because last class was Juneteenth, so we weren't supposed to have class last class. My apologies. So basically, last class was about Dickinson, so I wanted to continue with the idea of Dickinson today in the event that you celebrate Juneteenth and you weren't able to access our class on Thursday. And I am giving an extension for the attendance question, so that will be due today. Though I know some of you have already responded to it, so thank you very much. And you can see in the course outline where we are in the notes below. You can see that today is devoted to Dickinson. Our next class on Thursday will be devoted to incidents in the life of a slave girl. The class after that, the 1st of July, will be devoted to the Awakening, our last text of this semester. Then we have one more class, the 3rd of July, for anything that we need to catch up with, and we could devote the rest of the class to working on paper number 2. And then finally, on Tuesday the 8th is when we have our final exam, which I will be posting at 9 a.m. That would be due 24 hours later on Wednesday, the 9th at 9 a.m. It's also when paper number 2 is due. Certainly you can hand in paper number 2 early. Paper number 2 is similar to paper number 1, just dealing with one of the later texts in the semester. And if it turns out that you are going to do a revision of paper number 1, that would also be due by the ending of our semester. So in terms of where we are is talking about Emily Dickinson, and I kind of see her as a transition from a very long novel, Jane Eyre, to some shorter novels. And even our last text isn't a novel per se, it's a novella, The Awakening. So obviously, if you've seen the video with Emily Dickinson, you'll know that she wrote so many poems that it is impossible to read them all. I am hopeful that you read one or perhaps several, and I've given you a link as to where you can find some of her poetry. You can see this in the second section of the notes below from the Poetry Foundation. That's just a sampling. I had ordered for our class the Johnson edition, which the biography talked about, which published her poetry in its original form. And of course, that was so revolutionary because prior to that, her poetry was published after her death and it was edited so it would follow grammatical conventions, which is the last thing you do with poetry because poetry is not supposed to necessarily follow grammatical conventions. So, published in its original form, you can see that she highly favored the dash and would oftentimes use dashes at the endings of her lines rather than commas, and that she also favored irregular capitalization. So that's the way to know if you're reading an authentic Emily Dickinson poem, is to look to see if the poem you're reading has irregular capitalization and dashes. None of her poems were titled, so she basically wrote them for herself, and as the documentary talked about, she bound them up into little packets to give them a kind of order. And that means that we reference her poetry by its first line, which is what we do with Shakespeare's sonnets, by the way, which also were not titled, or by the number that editors have given them. And one of the things that I think is that is a strength about her poetry is that she really is able to articulate feelings. And if you think about how difficult it is to put language to a feeling, and I think that that's perhaps Emily Dickinson's strength. But Emily Dickinson is not an easy read, as we also saw in the documentary, that some of the scholars themselves struggled to understand Dickinson, which always made me feel better after I learned that. So you don't necessarily have to understand all of her poetry or even a poem in its entirety. I suggest that perhaps you focus on a stanza or even just a line of a piece of poetry and talk about why you find it to be so impactful, which is what the attendance question is that I gave an extension for today, is for you to identify either a poem or it could just even be a line or two that you find particularly powerful, and explain why. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems today, which happens to be Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So those of you who've taken me for Introduction to Composition know that we cover that particular poem because I think it does a good job of giving an overview of some of the main elements that you can expect when you are reading a Dickinson poem. And what we find out is that her poems oftentimes deal with paradoxes and oftentimes deal with unanswerable questions about life and death and the afterlife. As the documentary talked about, she was not particularly religious and even stopped going to church, which was rather significant for someone of her social status. She was, however, quite spiritual and felt that you could see and feel the spirituality in the world just by observing nature. So, the thing about Emily Dickinson is that while her poetry is quite personal to her own perspectives, it's also quite universal. I think all of us have understood some of the depth of emotion that she articulates in her poems. And death is one of those concepts that is very difficult to talk about, which she does quite adeptly. Some have suggested that she's a rather dark or negative poet because of that. And I truly don't think so, because she usually talks about death as a positive, because it's basically a kind of portal from the physical world to the spiritual world. And again, she wasn't necessarily religious in the formal sense of the word. She didn't necessarily believe in a book or a individual preaching about the afterlife. Her proof of the afterlife was the fact that she could see nature all around her. And in her writing, she oftentimes writes from the perspective of the afterlife, offering that as proof of an afterlife, her own poetry, which is rather bold. Many things about Emily Dickinson are bold. The fact that she chose to live her life the way she did, that someone of her social status, think persuasion, would have been married. And she not only did not marry, but she basically isolated herself and wrote poem after poem after poem. And of course, she had the luxury of being able to do so, the privilege of being able to do so, coming from a fairly affluent family in Amherst. And you can visit the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, and in the notes below, under the second section, at the bottom of the second section, I have included a link so that you could see the website for the Dickinson homestead, but of course, it's always better to visit on your own. Some of the themes that you can expect from her over 1,700 poems, believe it or not, are themes of love, loss, religion, nature, loneliness, and defiance. And again, what human being could say that they haven't experienced things of a similar magnitude? And not only did she live in Amherst, but she attended Mount Holyoke College, which was a college, a seminary basically for females at the time, as you would have learned in the documentary. But of course, when she defied the expectations of her institution by refusing to stand by saying that she was going to be salvaged or saved through salvation, we can see how Emily Dickinson was full of real life defiance, not necessarily the fictional defiance of someone like Jane Eyre. But of course, Jane Eyre was written by an author, Charlotte Bronte, and by writing Jane Eyre, we see an element of defiance. So these questions of the unknowable of human existence are questions that Emily Dickinson often tackles and follows patterns of all things Protestant hymnals, which also is quite fascinating for somebody who has rejected organized religion. There is a musicality in her poem. Poetry oftentimes does have a musicality. It's one of the reasons why the dashes are so important, the longer pauses, because it gives an opportunity to take a breath. It also emphasizes what is coming afterwards. But as the documentary had talked about, that in songs, the syntax, the organization of words is arranged in such a way so that it is possible to take a breath after every line so that the song is able to be sung. So that said, My favorite, as I said, or one of my favorites, I should say, because she's a superb author and it's difficult to find one particular favorite, is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So you can find this poem in the Poetry Foundation link that I had supplied to you. It's also poem 479 in the chronological ordering of her poetry. And if you were to look at her poem, and I'm going to read it to you, you'll see that many of the things that the documentary and I have talked about are evidenced in this poem. Because I could not stop for death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves, and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor, and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed the swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And you can see, just by looking at this poem, the use of the dash, the irregular capitalization. I think it works particularly nicely that death is capitalized because it personifies death. It makes death a literal entity. And the poem does illustrate how personal her poetry is because it's referencing I, which would be in reference to herself, but it's also universal because we all have to face death. And because I could not stop for death, the idea is that we don't have control over death. Death has control over us and when our time comes. He kindly stopped for me. Long literary tradition are referring to death as a male. Think about the Grim Reaper. And talking about death as kind, that's not usually what one thinks of for death. Usually death is seen as a negative, unless death can offer solace, a release from pain, and immortality, which is exactly what this poem argues. The carriage held but just ourselves. And there's a long literary tradition, too, of life being a journey. And this journey would have been taken in a carriage at that point, a horse-drawn carriage, when you think about the time period in which it was written in the 1800s. That death comes with immortality, and that's why death is kind. So that's the first stanza, and a stanza is a division in a poem. It looks much like a paragraph, and much like a paragraph, it usually talks about one topic or one idea. Not all poetry has to be divided up into stanzas, but this one is. And then we go to our next stanza, and you can see that there is a spacing to illustrate each of the different stanzas. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And if you think about it, this makes perfect sense. Why would death be concerned with time if their journey is to immortality? Time is a human construct, and it's limited in our world, but limitless in the immortal world. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So now death has been called not just kind, but civil. Labor and leisure, those are elements of the human world, and we need leisure because of labor. And that said, those are irrelevant constructs when you are in the afterlife and immortality. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So in this particular stanza, what we see are the stages of life here, represented by passing a school, which is where learning goes on. And school is usually associated with children, though, of course, in our perspective, school is associated with adults because we are in a college situation. But when you talk about school, the children, so this would represent our youthful selves, at recess in the ring. And in other words, this is the time of play. And if you know about the Ring Around the Rosie, pocket full of posy, which was a childhood game that was referencing, of all things, the plague and death. So there's a darkness there that children might not even realize as they are playing their playground games, or at least would have been playing these games during this time period. I don't know if kids still do that. Play Ring Around the Rosie and the Pocket Full of Posy. We pass the fields of gazing grain. So the idea of the fields of grain, this is supposed to represent adulthood and the time of work and the time of abundance and prosperity and fertility. We pass the setting sun. The setting sun is supposed to represent the ending of life, old age. Or rather, he passed us, the sun passed them as they continue moving outside of the earthly realm into the spiritual realm. The dews drew quivering and chill. So now we see that there's a time change as well, in that when the dews come out is basically when things are much later in the day or very early in the morning. For only gossamer my gown and my tippet only tulle. So if you know tulle, it's a very thin, insubstantial fabric. Tutus are sometimes made out of them. Wedding veils are sometimes made out of them. Gossamer, too, is supposed to be something that's a very thin and insubstantial fabric, oftentimes associated with the fairy world and having magical qualities. And the fact that her gown is made out of such a thin and insubstantial fabric, and tippet, which means a shawl, is also made of the same kind of fabric, illustrates that she has transitioned over into a realm where she no longer needs to worry about temperature and climate, and that we feel cold and hot because we live in the human realm. Again, that's nothing that you would find in the realm of the supernatural. And we pass before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. So you can imagine how far away this house must seem, so that it looks like it's a swelling on the ground. House is capitalized. Lots of possibilities for what that house could be. It could be the house of God. It could be a church, or literally, it could be the entranceway into heaven, or it could be a crypt, or it could be her literal home that actually she is being taken by before her burial, after her death, which is oftentimes a tradition in funerals. The roof was scarcely visible. That's why it looked like it was just coming out of the ground. It's so far away, it looked just like a swelling. And the cornice, which is an architectural element of a roof, in the ground. So it looked like it didn't surpass the ground, which shows again the distance that they have. And then the last stanza, which is really the stanza that's most important in terms of understanding this poem. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. In other words, the time that death came to take her was long ago. She's writing from the perspective of the afterlife. This is her proof that the afterlife exists, because she's in the afterlife writing from the perspective of the afterlife. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet it feels shorter than the day. And again, the idea of time is a human construct. It's not something necessarily that you would be worried about when you're in immortality. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And you can read that two ways. The horses' heads would obviously be the horses that are drawing forth the carriage onto their destination, which is how we began the poem. The horses' heads are also a biblical reference to the idea of the horsemen of the apocalypse, which are supposed to bring basically the ending of time, and that would mean immortality for everyone, or at least for those deserving of immortality. Again, making religious references, not necessarily because she is following the doctrine of man, but because she's following the doctrine of God, which of course makes her rather radical. I know that her life might seem very odd compared to the way that we would think about living a healthy life. And that's something that the documentary talked about. We might even use the word agoraphobic, in that she spent most of her time at home and most of the time in her room. There are all kinds of stories about her declaring that she hated housework, which again would have been revolutionary for the time. Just think about the cult of true womanhood. Though she did love to bake. One of my favorite stories is that she was invited to a social gathering, and at the time, letter writing was the way that you maintained friendships. It's almost like today when you want to think about texting. So as much as things change, they remain the same. So she had a fairly active social life, even though she didn't go out very frequently. And she was invited to a social gathering. Someone came to her door, and what she did was she opened her bedroom window and she lowered a basket from a that was attached to a rope, and there was a note in the basket with some baked goods. And the note said, please accept these baked goods in my absence for the social gathering. So one of the things I think that we can think about in terms of Dickinson is that she definitely was unconventional for her time, both in the way she wrote and in the way that she lived. So, thus far, we've been talking about authors who have broken boundaries because they've tackled subjects that have been unconventional. But now we've actually got people who are living unconventional lives, not just writing being the reason why their life is unconventional. Which leads us to our next story, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which I've often wondered why is not read at the high school level. I didn't read it at the high school level. Usually we think about slave narratives, and usually they're from the male perspective. Here we get the slave narrative from the female perspective. Yes, this is a true story, as unbelievable as it could sound. Um, Written by Harriet Jacobs, known as Linda Brent. And that's what we will talk about next class, the fact that there is a slave who was taught how to read and write, which would have been revolutionary on its own, who continually defied not just social conventions, but her specific enslavement and her master, and hid herself in a garret for years before she was able to obtain escape. And that said, reading this text, perhaps it's a little bit less literary than some of the other texts we've had, but I can't imagine any text being more powerful than the true life story of Harriet Jacobs, known as Linda Brent. And I've often wondered that the reason for the pseudonym is, can you imagine how difficult it must be to relive that story and to tell that story, and taking a pseudonym. And Linda means pretty in Spanish, by the way. So even though this isn't necessarily the most literary of the texts that we've read, there are still literary elements within it. One of the major characters is Mr. Sands, somebody who basically can't be pinned down, somebody who is very shifty, much like the Sands. So I think that again, all of these names are fictional, to protect identities of individuals. So that's what we will talk about next class. And I warn you that this book is quite graphic and brutal, because slavery is quite graphic and brutal. And then ultimately we end with the novella, which means that it's going to be longer than a short story, but not as long as a novel. And I think that we can all appreciate that at this point in the semester, as we're nearing towards the end. We end the way we began, with Kate Chopin. You remember we began with Story of an Hour. And if you're a Kate Chopin fan, I think you will see lots of similarities with Story of an Hour and the text we are going to be reading, The Awakening. In fact, even if you're not a fan, you'll probably see similarities. But there are definitely parallels between the two, with us ultimately having a class on the 3rd to catch up with anything we need to catch up with and work on paper number 2, which I hope you're contemplating at this point, and paper number 2 being due at the very ending of the semester. And of course, because of that, you wouldn't have the opportunity to rewrite paper number 2. So you want to pay particular attention to the comments I made on paper number 1. And if it turns out that you're having difficulty reading my handwriting, please let me know. I'll be happy to decipher for you. But at this point, everybody who has handed in paper number 2 should have received, or I'm sorry, everybody who's handed in paper number 1 should have received paper number 1 back from me. So if you haven't, please let me know. And all of you, hopefully, are in the midst of contemplating how to proceed with paper number 2. And certainly, even if you don't do a revision of paper number 1, take my comments and revisions into account when you're constructing paper number 2. Because I see the first paper is a learning exercise, and paper number 2, you're just developing what it is that you've learned. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And if for whatever reason it turns out that you can't answer the attendance question that I had extended until today for the 24th, identifying an Emily Dickinson poem or line you find to be particularly powerful and explaining why, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. And as you know, you don't need to respond to your peers unless you want to. You certainly are encouraged to, but you do need to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl. Take care. Bye-bye.